Is Trump's tariff relief offer to Canadian steel companies actually help, or is it something else entirely? In one sentence, it is not help at all, because the offer only applies if those companies agree to move their production and their jobs out of Canada and into the United States. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what this offer really means, how Canada is fighting back against it, and why one of the country's largest unions is calling it exactly what it looks like. Let's start with the tariffs themselves, because this story only makes sense once you understand how much pressure Canadian steel has already been under. Over the past 2 years, Washington placed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum entering the United States, one of the highest rates applied to any major trading partner. Then, this past April, those tariffs expanded even further, adjusted to cover a wider range of products containing steel, aluminum, and copper. For an industry that has relied on the American market for generations, sending huge volumes of steel south across a border that used to function almost like a seamless internal trade route, a tariff at this scale represents an existential threat, not a minor cost adjustment. To understand why this specific industry is so exposed, it helps to understand how integrated Canadian and American steel production became over the decades before this trade war began. Canadian steel mills and American manufacturers built supply chains assuming metal could cross the border almost as freely as it moved between two American states, with specialized products flowing in both directions depending on which side of the border had the right kind of mill for a particular grade or specification. A 50% tariff does not just add a cost to that relationship. It fundamentally breaks the economic logic that justified building such an interconnected supply chain in the first place. The damage has already shown up in real numbers, not just projections. According to the Canadian Steel Producers Association, the industry has already lost nearly 1,000 jobs since these tariffs took hold, and the association has warned that number could grow dramatically over the next 2 to 3 years, putting more than 6,000 steel jobs at risk across the country if conditions do not improve. These are not abstract statistics sitting in a government report somewhere. These are real positions in real communities, often in towns where the local steel mill or fabrication plant is one of the largest employers for miles in any direction. The steel industry as a whole supports roughly 23,000 direct jobs across the country and feeds into a much larger network of fabricated metal manufacturing that employs over 170,000 Canadians in total. When a core supplier industry like steel gets squeezed this hard, the damage rarely stays contained to the mills themselves. It ripples outward into every downstream business that depends on a steady, affordable supply of domestically produced metal, from construction firms to equipment manufacturers to the emerging data center industry that increasingly relies on steel for its physical infrastructure. Softwood lumber, another major Canadian export industry deeply tied to the American market, faces a similar threat, with roughly 30,000 jobs connected to businesses that rely heavily on selling into the United States. Between steel and lumber alone, we are talking about tens of thousands of Canadian livelihoods sitting directly in the path of this trade war, in industries that took decades to build and cannot simply relocate their customer base overnight, and in many cases cannot easily pivot to selling somewhere else either, given how deeply intertwined their supply chains and shipping infrastructure have become with the American market specifically over the decades since these trading patterns were first established. Now here is where the story takes a turn that deserves far more attention than it has gotten. In April of this year, reports emerged detailing a specific offer coming from the Trump administration aimed directly at Canadian steel and aluminum companies. The offer sounded, on the surface, like a potential lifeline. Tariff relief, a reduction in the punishing 50% rate that has been squeezing these companies for months. But that relief came with a condition attached. And the condition was not about production standards or environmental compliance or anything resembling a typical trade concession. The condition was that companies had to commit to moving their production, physically relocating their operations out of Canada and into the United States. Consider how unusual this kind of offer actually is in the history of trade negotiations between allied countries. Typical tariff relief negotiations involve concessions on things like market access, quota levels, product standards, or dispute resolution mechanisms, adjustments that let both countries continue trading with each other under revised terms. An offer that instead demands a company physically relocate, taking its entire operation across the border as the price of relief, is not really a trade negotiation at all in the conventional sense. It is closer to an ultimatum aimed at industrial capacity itself, treating Canadian factories and the communities built around them as a prize to be won, rather than a trading partner to be negotiated with. Think about what that actually means if you strip away the diplomatic language and look at the offer plainly. This was not a proposal to fix an unfair trade practice or address a genuine economic grievance between two countries. This was an offer that said, in effect, we will stop taxing you the moment you stop being a Canadian company and become an American one instead, taking your jobs, your payroll, your tax base, and your entire economic footprint along with you across the border. For a company's executives weighing this offer, the calculation is genuinely difficult, even if the underlying dynamic feels unfair. Continuing to operate in Canada under a 50% tariff might mean shrinking margins, layoffs, or eventual closure if the tariff never lifts. Accepting the offer and relocating might mean saving the company itself, even as it guts the very community that built it. That is precisely the kind of impossible choice this offer seems engineered to create, using genuine economic desperation as the mechanism to accomplish what a straightforward request to simply move operations would never have achieved on its own. Canada's largest steelworkers union did not mince words when this offer became public. Marty Warren, the national director of the United Steelworkers Union, put it about as bluntly as a labor leader possibly could, stating directly that this is not trade, it is economic coercion. He went further, calling the offer exactly what he believed it to be, blackmail and extortion, arguing that the United States was using tariffs specifically as a tool to force Canadian-based companies to move good jobs out of Canadian communities and into American ones. Warren did not stop at simply criticizing the offer either. He laid out what he believes needs to happen in response, calling for Canada to develop a genuine domestic steel industrial strategy, one that ties major infrastructure projects directly to Canadian production and Canadian jobs, backed by strong Buy Canadian rules and firm enforcement at the trade table. His message to Ottawa was direct. Canada should be willing to negotiate, but not at any cost, and any deal that locks in permanent tariffs or pressures Canadian companies to relocate should simply be rejected outright, regardless of the short-term pressure that rejection might create. He also called for immediate support measures for workers already feeling the squeeze, specifically pointing to improvements in employment insurance and continued investment in training programs, arguing that workers need protection now, in the middle of this uncertainty, not just a long-term strategy that might take years to fully materialize. That combination, immediate worker protection alongside a longer-term industrial strategy, reflects a union trying to fight this battle on two fronts simultaneously, protecting the people affected today while also working to prevent the underlying vulnerability from repeating itself in future trade disputes. That word choice matters because it reframes the entire tariff conversation in a way most coverage of this trade war has avoided. Tariffs are usually discussed as a blunt economic tool meant to protect domestic industry or punish unfair trading practices. But an offer structured specifically around relocating jobs, rather than fixing any actual trade imbalance, suggests something more deliberate, using the tariff itself as leverage, not to change how Canadian companies operate, but to change which country they operate in entirely. Warren's statement also pointed to something happening on the ground that gives this framing real weight, noting that Canadian steelworkers were already paying the price through layoffs, reduced production, and growing uncertainty across the entire industry, even before any company had accepted the relocation offer. In other words, the pressure campaign was already working in the background, softening up an industry through sustained tariff pain, making an offer to simply move production and escape that pain more tempting with every passing month the tariffs remained in place. Let's talk about how Canada has actually responded to this pressure, because the response has been substantial, even if it rarely makes international headlines. Ottawa has rolled out a genuinely large package of financial support aimed specifically at keeping these industries and their jobs inside Canada rather than losing them to relocation offers or simple attrition. A $5 billion strategic response fund now exists specifically to help strategic industries like steel adapt and compete. A separate $1 billion financing program through the Business Development Bank of Canada targets metal manufacturers and exporters directly, helping them access capital during a period when normal business planning has become extraordinarily difficult. Beyond the big headline numbers, Canada has layered in more targeted support too. A workforce tariff response program is investing $570 million over 3 years specifically to help workers in vulnerable industries, with $70 million earmarked directly for steel workers and $50 million for softwood lumber workers, funding retraining, skills development, and income support for those most directly exposed to this trade war. In Quebec alone, a separate $64 million investment is helping 99 small and medium-sized metal processing businesses adapt, protecting or creating more than 1,100 well-paying jobs in that province specifically. Federal officials tracking these programs report close to 1,500 applications from companies across steel, aluminum, lumber, manufacturing, automotive, and seafood sectors seeking support through the broader Regional Tariff Response Initiative, with more than 230 firms in the steel sector alone applying for assistance. According to government figures, these combined investments have already provided relief to nearly 37,000 Canadians during this period of uncertainty, and are credited with preventing more than 14,000 Canadians from losing their jobs entirely. Numbers that suggest this support package is not merely symbolic. It is actively changing outcomes for real workers facing exactly the kind of pressure this relocation offer was designed to exploit. There has also been a broader tightening of trade rules specifically designed to prevent foreign steel from flooding into the Canadian market through the back door, while American tariffs remain in place. A tariff rate quota framework first introduced last year has been extended, with industry advocates continuing to push for it to be tightened even further, arguing that global overcapacity in steel production worldwide makes strong protective measures more necessary now than when the framework was first created. Separately, a temporary remission that had allowed some American steel into Canada tariff-free for specific manufacturing uses expired at the end of January this year. A deliberate move meant to boost demand for Canadian steel by making the domestic product more competitive against any American steel still attempting to enter the country. Canada has also moved on the policy side, not just the funding side. A new Buy Canadian procurement policy, launched at the end of last year, now requires that federal contracts worth more than $25 million prioritize Canadian steel and aluminum, essentially guaranteeing a baseline of domestic demand regardless of what happens with American tariffs. Railway companies have agreed to cut freight rates for transporting Canadian steel and lumber between provinces by 50% starting this spring, making it cheaper and more practical for Canadian producers to sell to Canadian buyers instead of depending so heavily on the American market in the first place. Government officials have specifically pointed to emerging sectors like artificial intelligence data centers as a growing source of domestic steel demand, an industry barely on the radar a few years ago that is now consuming enough structural steel to meaningfully offset some of the American market Canadian producers have lost. Think about what this combination of policies actually represents strategically. Rather than simply begging Washington to reconsider the tariffs or accepting the relocation offer as inevitable, Canada is attempting something more ambitious, building enough domestic demand, financial support, and infrastructure that its steel industry becomes less dependent on the American market altogether, reducing the leverage those tariffs and that relocation offer actually carry over time. Let's talk about where this actually goes from here, because there are three realistic paths, and each one determines whether these Canadian jobs stay in Canada or eventually drift south. The first scenario, Canada's support package proves substantial enough to genuinely stabilize the industry, giving companies a real alternative to accepting the relocation offer. In this scenario, the combination of buy Canadian procurement, cheaper interprovincial shipping, and direct financial support creates enough domestic demand and breathing room that most steel producers choose to weather the tariff storm inside Canada rather than uproot their operations entirely. This is the outcome the Canadian government is clearly betting on, given the scale of money and policy attention being directed at exactly this goal. And the early data on jobs protected suggests this bet is at least partially paying off already. The second scenario, the tariff pressure simply outlasts Canada's support measures, and enough individual companies facing genuine survival pressure quietly accept the relocation offer over time, moving production south in a slow, company-by-company drift rather than any single dramatic announcement. This scenario would not necessarily make headlines all at once. It would show up gradually in plant closures, in job losses that outpace the numbers Canada's support programs can offset, and in a steel industry that looks meaningfully smaller and more hollowed out 5 years from now than it does today, even if no single dramatic relocation ever becomes the kind of story that dominates a news cycle on its own. The third scenario, and the one that would represent a genuine turning point in this entire trade war. The political and public backlash against openly offering to poach jobs from an ally rather than negotiating a genuine trade resolution becomes significant enough that Washington adjusts its approach, either softening the relocation condition or replacing it with a more conventional trade negotiation. Labor unions calling this exact kind of offer blackmail publicly, the way the United Steelworkers already have, creates exactly the kind of political pressure that has, in other moments throughout this trade war, eventually produced quieter policy adjustments once the optics became too uncomfortable to sustain. Whichever path unfolds, this story reveals something important about how this trade war has actually evolved over its course. Earlier disputes in this relationship were mostly about market access, about who gets to sell what, at what price, into whose market. This steel relocation offer represents something different, and in some ways more aggressive, an attempt to directly extract the underlying economic activity itself, the jobs, the payroll, the tax base, rather than simply negotiating better terms for trade to continue happening across the border the way it always has. Here is my honest read on where this settles. I think Canada's support package is substantial enough to prevent the kind of mass exodus the relocation offer seems designed to produce, but I do not think it fully eliminates the pressure either. Some companies, particularly smaller ones with less capacity to weather prolonged uncertainty, will likely still find the offer too tempting to refuse, even as larger, better capitalized producers hold their ground inside Canada with government support behind them. The bigger point I want you to sit with is this. When a tariff dispute stops being about trade terms and starts being about which country gets to keep the jobs entirely, it reveals something honest about what these conflicts are actually fighting over underneath all the policy language. Not just prices, not just market access, but the actual economic lifeblood of specific communities, the kind of steel town where 3 generations of the same family might have worked at the same mill, now facing a choice imposed from outside their own country's borders. That is a fundamentally different kind of pressure than a simple import tax, and it deserves to be understood and discussed as what it actually is, rather than folded quietly into the broader, more familiar language of tariffs and trade deficits that dominates most coverage of this relationship. So, here's the question I want you to sit with. If your own community's largest employer received an offer like this, tariff relief in exchange for relocating across the border, taking every job with it, would you consider that a reasonable business decision the company should be free to make, or something closer to what the United Steelworkers are calling it? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me whether you think Canada's support programs are enough to actually keep these jobs where they are. If breaking down these overlooked, less headline-friendly pressure tactics inside this trade war is useful to you, hit subscribe, because this kind of direct pressure on jobs themselves, rather than just prices, is likely to keep showing up in other industries as this trade war continues. And if you have not seen our breakdown of how Canada fought back against tariffs on aluminum and copper, go watch those next, because the same underlying fight over who keeps the jobs and who keeps the leverage runs through every single one of these stories. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.